In the Rite of Spring, the basic formal unit is the block, a chunk of music distinctive in melodic, harmonic, and rhythmic content, as well as texture and instrumentation. Blocks range in length from a single measure to a substantial passage. Blocks are articulated from each other by sharp breaks unmediated by transitions. Creating musical form in this way is one of Stravinsky's most radical and distinctive strokes, and it packs a powerful aesthetic punch. If the normally abled musical body, that is, the classic romantic musical body, is organically whole, its form naturally continuous, seamless, and smooth, then the Stravinskyan musical body, in contrast, is fractured, fragmented, shattered, and splintered. The fracturing of the form into discrete blocks is a potent musical emblem of the primitive, with short and often violent utterances supplanting long lyrical lines. The opening section of the Ritual of Two Rival Tribes involves rapid intercutting between contrasting material, a timpani and trombone blast representing the first tribe, a fanfare representing the second tribe, and a combination of blast and a slightly different fanfare representing again the first tribe. In evocation of the ancestors, the boundaries between similar blocks are enforced by silences or strong musical punctuation. Each block here has two components, a bass timpani outburst announcing the onset of a new block, and an answering chorale in the strings and winds. Within each block, the music is usually stratified into two layers, one harmonic and one melodic. Each layer may be composed of one, two, or several strands. Just as the time of the piece is articulated into formal blocks, the space of the piece is articulated into distinctive layers, and with some of the same expressive impact. The music does not meld into a harmonious whole, but is divided against itself. Its consciousness is bifurcated. The strands within the harmony layer often take the form of sustained, repeated, or oscillating chords, which may be enlivened by patterns of arpeggiation and elaborated by brief interjections. They may also involve ostinato patterns, which may or may not be fully aligned. In this passage from the introduction to Part 1, the melodic layer consists of a chromatic melody later used to represent the old woman. The harmony layer has several strands, a sustained E major triad, a trilling figure G sharp, A sharp, a rapidly leaping ascent G sharp, D sharp, A sharp, D sharp, and a repeated D sharp. In this passage from the Sacrificial Dance, the melodic layer consists of two statements of a short, brutal fragment that descends chromatically, G sharp, G, F sharp. The harmonic layer is represented by a repeated chord, mostly a D minor triad, plus B flat and E. In this passage from the Augurs of Spring, the melodic layer consists of a melody associated with the young women. The harmonic layer is mostly around G major, within a prevailing G mixolydian, and amplified by ostinatos and other repeated figures within the individual harmonic strands. The melody layer usually contains a single melody, but sometimes it contains more than one distinctive melody, or a melody and a relatively featureless countermelody. In this passage from Auguries of Spring, the melody layer contains two melodies, a flute melody associated with young women, and a trumpet melody that prefigures the main tune from Spring Rounds, where it appears as a sort of religious procession. The trumpet melody has a planing accompaniment to be discussed more in a moment. Everything else in the passage, 4 ostinatos and 2 brief scalar interjections, belongs to the harmonic layer. In this passage from the ritual action of the ancestors, 2 exotic-sounding chromatic melodies, one for alto flute and one for English horn, occupy the melody layer. The harmony layer is a trudging, repeated bass chord in the manner of a military march, played by tutti horns and strings with timpani on the offbeats. Later in the same scene, over the same trudging bass, we hear 2 different melodies in the melody layer, a doom-laden melody in the trombones, associated with the sage and the ancestors, and a sinuous, exotic-sounding melody in the alto flute, one that Kraft refers to as snake charmer. A particularly common way in which the melody layer is thickened involves planing. Additional melodic lines track and amplify the main melody in rhythmic homophony with mostly parallel motion. Planing takes different forms. It may be tonal, with the parallelism adjusted to a prevailing diatonic environment, or real, the parallel intervals are all of the same size and quality. It may involve a single line or full triads or seventh chords. It may also involve more dissonant combinations and motion that is nearly but not uniformly parallel. The different forms of planing have distinctive expressive impacts. Planing may have the effect of added weight, as though the melody were forced to carry a burden, or it may simply heighten the impact of the melody. In some cases, if the planing is thick and the tempo is slow, it may produce the effect of a multi-voice chorale. The expressive impact will vary with the local context, including tempo, rhythm, dynamics, and instrumentation. But in general, the thinner and more consonant the planing, the more likely it is to be heard as sweet, gentle, and lyrical. And the thicker and more dissonant the planing, the more likely it is to be heard as burdensome or menacing. In this passage, each melody note is associated with a major or minor triad, and the triads are adjusted to the prevailing F-Lydian diatonic collection, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F. The blaring fanfare qualities of the melody are amplified by the planing among tutti winds and brass. This melody is a preliminary statement of what turns out to be the principal melody in a later scene, the Spring Rounds, where it suggests a solemn religious procession. It is accompanied with parallel 6/5 chords, adjusted to the prevailing E-flat Dorian collection. The planing adds a sense of weight and ponderousness to the musical gait. This melody, a lyrical feminine second theme with which the young women entreat the young men to moderate their violent games, is accompanied in parallel thirds below. These thirds do not conform to any diatonic collection, however, with C sharp and D sharp in the melody, but C natural and D natural in the accompanying line. The parallelism here is real, not tonal. The melody here is in the lower voice, accompanied by a single line above, moving in parallel 11s. There is something strange and otherworldly about this apparently bitonal clash, in its delicacy on the one hand, and its strong dissonance on the other. This melody is accompanied by two streams of parallel thirds, with every major third in one stream combined with a minor third in the other. The result is a dissonant three-note chord on every beat. The passage is simultaneously exuberant and harsh, appropriate for a moment of violent male triumph. The melodic fragments G, F sharp and B flat, C, D flat are accompanied with parallel 11s filled in either as 5+6 or 6+5, a violent celebration of a violent act. The whole tone melody is accompanied in parallel thirds. An additional part of the homophony is static, producing overall oblique motion. Like the dancers in this scene, the music moves in a big crowd, with some moving around rapidly and some jumping in place. The melody alternates C and D. In a chorale-like homophony, the melody is accompanied by parallel lines and static motionless lines. The melody is like a chant, and the oblique planing gives the feeling of a single sustained intonation as the sonic foundation for the chant. The melody here is amplified by planing, but the motion is not strictly parallel among the 6 lines. The resulting chords are mostly triads with added notes, and the effect is that of an off-kilter chorale in a gentle, lyrical, pastoral setting. This is the ultimate in complex dissonant planing. There are 2 strands of planing accompaniment here. The upper strand follows the melody around in mostly parallel motion with triads and 7th chords. The lower strand provides mostly chromatic clusters that stay mostly in place. The chosen one's melody is not so much amplified as crushed by the accompanying lines that adhere to it. Blocks may be connected to form pairs or larger groupings, sections. Blocks may alternate, a formal oscillation analogous to the chordal oscillation that occupies many harmony layers, or it may be interspliced in more complex ways. The oscillation or interspersion of blocks may have the effect of impeding a sense of directed forward motion. The music is immobilized, shuffling in place rather than, as in more traditional musical forms, moving forward purposefully toward predetermined goals. Persistent ostinatos may bind a series of blocks together. Blocks may also be connected through a gradual process of accumulation, as each successive block and section adds strands to its melodic and harmonic layers, leading to shattering cacophonous climaxes. Scenes may end with a repeat of their opening blocks. In such cases, the mood is usually gentle, quiet, and pastoral. In the faster and wilder scenes, we find the intersplicing and oscillation of short snippets within the blocks, a process that may have the effect of grouping blocks together into larger sections. In this section, from the ritual of two rival tribes, we find rapid intercutting of distinct blocks, one representing the young women as they flirt with and entreat the men, and the others representing the two tribes of young men as they pursue their games of mock combat. In slower, more meditative scenes, an alternation of distinct blocks may create a larger section. In this section of the introduction to Part 2, the young women's round dance, their mystic circle melody, alternates with a sinuous two-part counterpoint. In some cases, the music is composed in short snippets that run through successive blocks, binding them into a section. In the opening of naming and honoring of the chosen one, the repetition, oscillation, and intercutting of 4 short snippets forges the first 3 blocks into a discrete section. It's the large A section of this ABA form scene. In many scenes, there are ostinatos that cut across the block boundaries, binding blocks into larger sections. In some scenes, augurs of spring, dancing out of the earth, and ritual action of the ancestors, ostinatos continue throughout virtually the entire scene, binding all of the blocks. Ostinatos are extraordinarily pervasive in the Rite of Spring, and they often enforce a sense of circularity, of music incessantly doubling back on itself, highly animated and charged with energy, but not going anywhere. In this section of augurs, a four-note ostinato binds four successive blocks into a larger section. In several scenes, the blocks are connected by a gradual process of accumulation, with either the melodic layer or the harmonic layer continually thickened by added strands. Scenes organized in this way move toward shattering climaxes through textural thickening and build-up. The process of accumulation lends a sense of direction to the musical form, otherwise held back by the fragmentation into blocks and the pervasive ostinatos. This block from Spring Rounds is connected to previous blocks by a shared melody, the Spring Rounds procession, and a shared bass pattern. Here at the end of the A section of a larger ABA form, the melody layer is thickened with planing, leading to a shattering climax. Coming at the end of the first half of ritual action, this block maintains melodies and ostinatos from previous blocks and adds additional strands in a climactic process of accumulation. Whole scenes may be articulated by having their last block repeat music from their first block, providing a sense of circularity at this high formal level. Scenes with this formal arrangement usually begin and end in a tranquil, peaceful pastoral mode. That's the case in the introduction to Part 1. The pastoral opening folk melody returns to close off the scene, transposed a semitone lower. Very much the same thing happens in Spring Rounds. The pastoral opening folk melody returns to close off the scene, initially at the same pitch level, but ending a whole tone higher. Several scenes are cast in a simple ABA form. Mystic Circles is one. The naming and honoring of the chosen one is another scene in a simple ABA form. Some scenes have more elaborate formal arrangements. The first scene of the ballet, the introduction to part one, and the last scene, the sacrificial dance, can both be thought of as rondo forms, A, B, A, C, A. That formal resemblance between them suggests that the ballet as a whole involves a sense of return to its opening, despite the radical shift in mood. Here are the principal parts of the introduction to part one. And here are the principal parts of the sacrificial dance, another sort of rondo. Rondo form is something that the introduction to part one, the first scene of the ballet, and the sacrificial dance, the last scene of the ballet, have in common. Just as blocks are combined to form scenes, scenes are combined to form the two large parts of the ballet and the ballet as a whole. The links between adjacent scenes are particularly strong. Adjacent scenes are often bound together in a dense network of cross-references. The cross-references are so extensive and so systematic and so in excess of any possible choreographic or dramatic requirements as to constitute a fully symphonic conception of musical form and structure. The most common sort of interconnection is when the principal tune in one scene is prefigured as a secondary tune in the preceding scene. In Augurs of Spring, a new tune enters as a counter-melody to the primary young women's tune. The same melody returns in Spring Rounds as the main melody for the scene, transformed into a slow religious procession. A fanfare melody with which the men celebrate their forcible abduction of the women in the ritual of abduction becomes the melody in the central vivo section of Spring Rounds. Sometimes the last thing that happens in one scene becomes the first thing, often transformed in some way, that happens in the next scene. The four-note ostinato that dominates Augurs of Spring is heard first as a premonition at the end of Part 1 introduction. A melodic figure heard repeatedly throughout naming and honoring of the chosen one returns as a strong, loud, punctuating outburst in the bass at the beginning of evocation of the ancestors. Some of the cross-references are more subtle, involving significant transformation of the shared material or widely distant spans of time in the ballet, or both. In the introduction to Part 2, the melody for the B section is sinuous, chromatic, and slightly exotic in feeling. In ritual action, the same melody takes on a somewhat more menacing quality. The ancestors are trying to mesmerize the chosen one, holding her immobile with their mysterious music. In the sacrificial dance, the once charming melody, its notes now played loudly in descending order, has become brutal and demonic. A subtle cross-reference binds the opening folk melody of the ballet to the tumultuous end of the ballet in the concluding sacrificial dance. The opening melody of the ballet is oriented toward the minor third, C-A. The same pair of notes is pounded out in the timpani throughout the final measures of the ballet. The gentle pastoral has undergone a demonic inversion, binding the beginning and ending of the ballet and marking the limits of a dramatic journey. The principle of rotation operates at all levels in the ballet. In the arrangement of notes within a melody, of melodies and chords within a block, of blocks within a section, of sections within a scene, and of scenes within the two parts of the ballet and the ballet as a whole. Musical events occur in a particular order. Once an end is reached, the beginning returns and the pattern starts over. Repetition, cyclicity, circularity, and the promise of return, ends lead always back to new beginnings, are intrinsic to rotational form. In all of these aspects, rotational form is closely affiliated with religious rituals and rites, which occur in a particular order throughout the year and within which events occur in a particular order. In this Rite of Spring, rotational form is the emblem of circular ritualistic time, endlessly renewing, with every end simultaneously a new beginning. The melodies in the Rite of Spring very often involve repeated traversals of a small repertoire of pitches, often a diatonic scale segment within the ambitus of a perfect fourth. In the young women's melody, heard as the female dancers make their first entrance on stage, the melody leaps from B-flat to E-flat and then descends by step to its starting point. We can think of the melody as a whole as three rotations of that sequence of notes, with each rotation beginning and ending on B-flat. The melody is thus repetitive and circular in design. The same tetrachord is the locus of a slow religious procession in spring rounds. It moves stepwise up from B-flat to E-flat and then back down again. The melody can be heard as 6 rotations, some complete and some incomplete, of its basic pattern. Its ends are its beginnings. The same type of scalar tetrachord, but in a different pitch location, underpins the melody from ritual action that accompanies the mocking and condemnation of the chosen one by the ancestors and elders. Again, the organizing principle is rotational, with 2 passes through the same pattern of notes. The first part of the sacrificial dance is composed from small recurring musical fragments labeled A, B, and C. Each statement of A can be heard to initiate a rotation. We hear 7 statements of either AB or ABC. The arrival on C both signals the end of a block and heralds an immediate return to A. The ABA and ABACA formal schemes we discussed earlier can also be thought of rotationally. Formal rotations begin on the A material, and every departure from A heralds a return to A. This is true of an ABA form, like the mystic circles and the naming and honoring of the chosen one. It is also true of ABACA rondo forms, like the introduction to Part 1 and the sacrificial dance. Indeed, the Rite of Spring as a whole, the whole ballet, can be thought of as a rotational form. Just as the dancers on stage so often dance in a circle, the time of the ballet is also circular. The drama symbolically spans a single 24-hour day, ending as it began right before dawn. Similarly, each of the 2 parts of the ballet can be heard to span a single 4-season year, ending as it began right before spring and spanning 2 cycles of life from birth to death. Dramatically, it enacts 2 large moves through a succession of expressive modes: pastoral, military, religious, and dance of life or death. Musically, the final sacrificial dance ends where the introduction to Part 1 began, with a focus on a single interval, the descending minor third from C to A. To fully understand these rotational circular movements, we will have to get more deeply into the melodic, harmonic, rhythmic, and dramatic aspects of this astonishing work.